In order to establish civilized order in society, and, first and foremost, in the spiritual aspect, it is necessary for the society to have as many as possible spiritually literate people. This refers to those who perfect and transform themselves spiritually, expanding their horizons of knowledge. At first stages, it is imperative for such people to join forces for the purpose of disseminating the knowledge in various spheres of society. It is necessary to create conditions for more enlightened and intellectually developed people in the world community, in whom the spiritual nature dominates, who would have free access to the primordial knowledge for cognizing the world and themselves. Anastasia, in other words, to do everything possible so that the priorities based on the internal need to create and increase good became firmly established in society. I give to God and I give to people, rather than the current give and take format of consumer thinking of buying and selling. Rigdon, absolutely right. So then, next it is necessary to abolish the very structure of priesthood, this mass of various religious hierarchies and armies of priests who perform sacrificial rites and who consider themselves to be intermediaries between people and God, no matter how he may be called in different religions, but, in fact, who just live at the expense of the public. For many of them, religion is a mere occupation and a source of income, acquired at the expense of ordinary believers' labor. It is a means of manipulation of mass consciousness through faith for political purposes. In order to abolish the structure of priesthood, revolutions are not necessary. There is no need to organize bloody showdowns, strife, and similar provocations of the animal nature. It is possible to abolish the system in a peaceful way. After all, priests are people, too, just like everybody else. They also tend to make mistakes just like any person. It is simply necessary to create such conditions for society in which the institution of priesthood disintegrates on its own as unnecessary. Then people who belong to it will find themselves in other professions which are more useful for society, according to their real priorities and choices in life. Anastasia, how do we create such conditions? Rigdon, in fact, it is not that difficult. People should simply stop sinning themselves, by seducing priests with their alms. In the end, when this business ceases to bring them personal income, they will be forced to take off their priestly garments and go to work for the benefit of society just like everyone else. In general, if we speak about the concept of sin as a religious term, alms to priests can be called one of the heaviest sins, no matter what denomination they belong to. Why? A person donates to priests and their army of hired servants in the mistaken belief that they are more holy than him, that these people wearing other garments are closer to God and, therefore, their prayer is more effective. But priests are people just like the rest. They have not yet saved themselves and their soul, so how can they save others? At the same time, once again, the person should stop and think for whom this material sacrifice is made and for what purposes. So the material alms of believers are needed only by the army of priests. God needs neither money nor other riches of the material world. Relations between man and God are based solely on the deepest, personal feelings of the person from the contact with the spiritual world, his sincere love and gratitude to God. These true deepest feelings of man towards God are the only real treasure that can be accepted by that world. These relationships with the spiritual world take place without any intermediaries. It should be understood that as long as the person evaluates the world from the perspective of a resident of three-dimensional space, that is, through the prism of his material thinking, then in many spiritual matters he will be full of illusions cast by his pride. He thinks that since he has deigned to pay some of his attention to the spiritual world, then entire hosts of angels have to take care of him, cater to his requests, and practically carry him to paradise on royal pillows. In reality, until the personality matures spiritually, it is unnoticeable to the spiritual world. I apologize for a commonplace human comparison, but such personalities are like millions of reproductive cells. Gametes have a set of chromosomes and carry hereditary characteristics. A person does not even notice their material emergence, existence, and death. Moreover, he sometimes uses their power without even realizing it. However, when two gametes fuse into a zygote and embryo begins to develop, here at least one person, I mean the woman, in the spiritual sense, the divine feminine principle, will be unable to ignore this fact. She will surely pay close attention to this phenomenon and will take care of the new being in the future. It is the same in the spiritual aspect. People need to develop themselves diligently, master spiritual practices, live by means of communication with the world of God at a deep level of feeling so that the personality is able to fuse with the soul and they earn the right to be accepted into eternity. Then the spiritual world, too, will turn its attention to this individual, it will dote on him as a long-awaited new perfect being. Unfortunately, the ancient truth about achieving fusion of the personality with the soul has been lost in the modern world, and a person, hoping to express his love and gratitude towards God, gives material alms to priests, thereby pandering to the animal mind in tempting and seducing people in priestly garments with the material world. You sin, and the priest sins by taking the alms, which become a subject of temptation for him. With your alms, you make him think not about the spiritual but about the material, not about taking care of his soul and true service to God but of increasing his material income. Do you understand where the severity of this sin lies? With his alms, a person pushes the personality and the soul of the priest into hell, inclining his choice in favor of matter, that is, the animal mind, while also burdening himself with this sinful act. This sin is even more terrible than killing the human body, because the body is a temporary garment, in fact, ashes. While this sin is like a deadly poison for the soul, which deprives this personality of the chance to break through to eternal life. At the heart of such material alms and sacrifice lies a substitution of the animal mind in the form, as you have mentioned, of the typical purchase and sale formula, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, belief in the possibility of a material buyout, a payoff for their sins, and in acquisition of new wealth in the future, from health to prosperity. Anastasia, many people have just never stopped and thought about it. At that, ordinary believers regard such requests of alms in favor of the church as natural and humane, because this implies helping other people. Since usually priests and their servants justify their requests of alms, for example, by construction of a new temple, church needs, previously in sermons, the word church was often linked to the concept of heavenly church, help to the needy believers and so on. Nobody reports to the flock about the actual circumstances of distribution of this public money or provides them with any financial statements of income and expenses. Rigdon, in a normal civilized society, helping other people, just like building, for example, a temple intended for collective spiritual practices, can and should be done by associations of ordinary citizens, residents of a particular locality or a settlement. All this is done according to the following principle: people come together, decide, and get it done if it really is vitally important for the locals and if they really wish it. For instance, people in a village want to build a temple, for themselves, their children, and fellow villagers. They are to live here and they should decide how to live, not someone from above. And you can rest assured that for themselves, their relatives, friends, and children, spiritually competent people will certainly build an appropriate temple without signs that activate the material nature in man, but only with signs that awaken people's spiritual component. In a temple or at another place intended for collective spiritual practices, people will exchange knowledge and experience as equals and pray together for the salvation of their souls to the glory and gratitude of God's love. They will not conduct, like the majority of priests in today's temples, political or priestly religious monologues for the flock, mixing spiritual knowledge with the desires and aims of the animal nature or indoctrination according to priestly programs. For this will indeed be intended for people and their spiritual development, and not for mixing spiritual grains with material aims or for priestly business and exact ions from the flock by recruits in priestly garments. In it, people will be developing themselves spiritually independently. No one should profit from temples and places where people gather for spiritual development and communication. As soon as exact ions, sales, paid services, or paying salaries to anyone start in temples or holy places, temptations will arise as well, how to earn more and then how to get more power without much effort. After all, for an idle mind, it is easier to carry a candle in a pompous theatrical ritual and to liken one's pride to the analogy with the Supreme Being than to work with a pneumatic hammer in a coal mine. And the person will not even notice himself falling into a web of vices. This is a long-known maneuver of the animal nature. But it is not about temples as such but about people. One can engage in spiritual perfection anywhere, both outdoors and indoors. I have already recounted how in the ancient times, people engaged in spiritual development in caves, and generations of people came there and learned spiritual practices by the signs and symbols painted on the rock walls by their ancestors. These caves still exist today, no one has been tempted by their material poverty, and spiritually literate people can use the spiritual values, the knowledge, even now. Priests of different religions, as far back as the ancient times, would build magnificent temples to perform their rituals, decorating them with gold and jewels, for example, in ancient Egypt, Babylon, ancient Greece, and so on. And where are those temples now? They have been replaced by ruins, and the gold has long been looted by the people who were tempted by such material treasures. It is a disgrace to tempt people with material things in the places where spiritual education takes place. So, people must not be allowed to make a profit from the spiritual aspiration of others. Dissemination of spiritual knowledge must not bring any financial or other material benefit to a person. This is the only way it is possible to avoid material temptations, and then the person will do this with all of his heart and soul, with sincerity of his spiritual intentions. Anastasia, yes, the problem of most believers is that by making donations to religions, people, in fact, in a way buy their way out of the spiritual work on themselves, writing off the matters of their conscience onto priesthood. Instead of doing good themselves in the world, it is easier for them to give money to the servants of the altar. And the priesthood uses this with impunity. Rigdon, unfortunately, this is so. However, not quite with impunity, for no one has yet succeeded, and no one will in the future, in avoiding personal judgment, and each person will be rewarded according to his deeds and thoughts. As for the people themselves who attempt to buy their way out of spiritual work at the expense of alms to priests, that is their mistake. In fact, this is self-deception, for no matter what material ransom a person has made up for himself, no one will do the spiritual work for him. It is not his money in the temple that is important but his personal involvement in the constructive deeds of society and personal spiritual changes associated with this. As for donations and temples, it is enough for an intelligent person to look at the realities of today. Construction of churches in cities has been turned into business projects. What is taken into consideration is not quality but quantity, not how many people will truly be able to have exposure to the spiritual but what economic profitability and political benefit it will bring. At that, every religious organization, especially in big cities, tries to grab for itself a piece of land closer to areas of mass gatherings of people in order to ensure the biggest influx of parishioners. The fragmentation of religion into sects and their strife with each other is just a fight for power, where the importance of a person is judged by his wallet, and power over ordinary believers is seen as political power over electorate. Everything is turned upside down. And it can only be set right when people in society become more competent in spiritual matters themselves, begin to expand their horizons of knowledge and outlook, do what they can to participate in the life of society, live with God inside, and do good and creative deeds. Then the need for commercial brokers between God and man will cease to exist. Anastasia, in connection with this, another important question arises. In the priestly army, there are certainly people who have chosen to serve one or another religion with hope of spiritual liberation, without knowing the true state of affairs in the system before getting into it. However, even while in it and observing things that are not shown to the masses of believers, they haven't lost in this political dirt the purity of their faith and their sincere intentions to serve only God and not priestly clans. Once you said that the true spirituality of such, in fact, God's people, who, unfortunately, are very few in the whole world, is what holds up, like pillars, the glory of any mass religion or belief. If the system of religions is abolished as such, what should people do who are truly walking towards God, while engaged in spiritual asceticism and at the same time sincerely help other people for free? Rigdon, well, first of all, today there are too few of those who have the sincere desire to serve God instead of their pride, by taking care of the human souls without getting remuneration for it, at that. In fact, such people are indeed few among the millions who serve in the army of priests of different religions. The overwhelming majority of those who serve in religions are outsiders who have been tempted by material aims and not by spiritual salvation. And, secondly, no external changes will stop the internal spiritual process for the true God's people. Even after changing their profession and working, like everyone else, for the benefit of society, they will continue to develop themselves spiritually just as sincerely, devoting their free time to helping others. For this is their spiritual need, their internal life, which prevails over circumstances of this world. So, external changes will not stop them, rather they will delight them, given what they have to face and see in the everyday interior life of a religious community, as well as in the actions and deeds of their colleagues. One of the necessary conditions for achieving a qualitative transformation of society is the understanding by people themselves the meaning of their spiritual development as well as the cessation of participation in tempting with power and material values of the people who belong to the army of priesthood. Do not give them money, donations, or presents of any kind. Do not appease their pride with bowing, worshipping, hand-kissing, servility, obedience, supplications, or similar temptations for their animal nature. In other words, you must not sin yourself and provoke others into it. After all, this person is just like you. He, a servant of the sacrifice cult, does not differ from an ordinary person in any way, since his soul is also located in the body, in this material world. Here, no one can be either lower or higher, for all human souls suffer equally from this material captivity. A human being has only one way out of these material pincers, to develop spiritually and liberate his soul, leave for the world of God. There are no such people who have not at least once felt this need coming from their soul and manifesting in aspiration for true spiritual freedom. It is a different matter that man's animal nature interprets this need of the soul in its own way, distorting the very concept of freedom, endowing it with material quality, which is alien to spiritual nature. All people are believers, only each person uses the power of his faith as he chooses. By the way, those who consider themselves to be quite ardent atheists are actually, when they are alone, prone to the same fears and superstitions as any believer. In society, these people are basically those same priests, only on a small scale, the only difference being, they openly glorify qualities of the animal nature, their self-love, pride, vanity, and so on. Anastasia, once the institution of the priesthood is abolished in society, how can people avoid similar mistakes in the future? I mean, while disseminating spiritual knowledge, how not to be tempted by pride, vanity, how not to desire power over your own kind, that is, how to resist temptations of the animal nature. Rigdon, if the civilization moves in the spiritual direction, it will be possible to solve this issue quite easily. It must be understood that a human being has a dual nature, and constant swings between the animal and the spiritual nature take place in him. Consequently, it must be done in such a way that spiritual cognition and dissemination of universal humanitarian primordial knowledge is not to the advantage of man's animal nature as a conductor of the animal mind, representing the material world and its interests, but so that it is absolutely acceptable and favorable for development of the spiritual nature in man as a conductor of the spiritual world. It is important to make the primordial spiritual knowledge accessible to all people, and while disseminating it, eliminate any possibility of tempting people with incentives of the animal nature. Anastasia, so, it is necessary for people themselves to create such conditions in society, in which for those who spiritually educate others, it would be materially disadvantageous. Rigdon, yes, in this matter it is necessary to eliminate any possibilities of manipulation of public consciousness by conductors of the animal mind, as well as any chance of someone deriving economic profit or political benefit. Furthermore, it is necessary to prevent distortion of information and manipulation of it to someone's advantage, that is, this kind of manifestation of discretionary power in the field of knowledge dissemination. Anastasia, however, this will truly be possible only when many people learn the basics of the primordial knowledge. And when the world community has this information, the majority of people will begin to accurately separate the spiritual wheat from the chaff, and they will not succumb to the influence and provocations of people with bad intentions. They will be able to ignore manifestations of the animal nature within themselves and uphold the spiritual nature in their community and the environment. Rigdon, absolutely. First of all, people should awaken spiritually, and then these vestiges of colonial thinking will fall off on their own in society, and a whole army of various parasites and their freeloaders, who live at the expense of people's faith, will be cast out of the spiritual field. For as long as they live off ordinary people, they will come up with any number of things just to live their lives as social parasites, freeloaders in society, and so that on top of it people kiss their hands for that and hold them in high esteem. People must learn to be the masters of their own spiritual destiny and not to expect someone to do their vital spiritual work for them. They must independently perfect themselves, work on themselves, and broaden their horizons of cognition of the world. Not to expect mercy from priests and politicians, not to indulge in illusions, and not to allow themselves to be manipulated. It is necessary to be a more mature personality, a socially active and spiritually responsible human being. And in order not to repeat the mistakes of the past and to avoid the dependence on the will of the animal mind in the future, as well as distortions of spiritual knowledge and return to the priestly schemes, it is necessary that those who decided to help themselves and other people in spiritual matters did that to the detriment of their pride and material interests. Because, as I have already said, where financial interest appears or the possibility to satisfy one's pride, get any kind of benefit or gain privileges and power over someone, sooner or later a temptation will arise and a weakness of the human spirit will manifest itself. How does this look in real life? If a person independently improves himself, has a spiritual experience and an inner need to disseminate spiritual knowledge, he helps people in his spare time, they learn and, in their turn, they also help other people in these matters, and those help the next ones. But everyone should work for the benefit of society, have some sort of civilian occupation, earning their daily bread with their work. In their spare time, people must study and share experience and knowledge with others as equals, like with good friends, suppressing their animal nature and guided by the spiritual nature in their actions. This is a real help to people, and at the same time work on yourself, detection of manifestations in yourself of the spiritual and animal natures, effective control over one's thoughts, studying one's nature, and spiritual development. That is the point, you yourself grow and help others. Do you understand what is so special about disseminating spiritual knowledge in this way? A person goes to share the knowledge about God with people and spends his own time, his effort, and resources, without getting anything material in return, no temptations or gratification of his animal nature. The only thing that he gets is spiritual augmentation while communicating dispassionately with souls of the people who are suffering just like him. What you sow in yourself is what you will eventually reap. Spiritual to spiritual and material to the material. That is, this person sacrifices his earthly selfhood in the form of ambitions of his animal nature on the spiritual altar of his life, and also multiplies his spiritual gifts as a result of communication with people. These gifts are not material, not money, food, things, or human ambitions from pride. This is exactly that spiritual component which a person passes to other people through the spiritual knowledge. For, by disseminating spiritual knowledge, the person thus resists the unified animal mind, and helps others, at least a little bit, to know, feel, and understand the divine essence that is hidden in them and that does not belong to the material world. Matter is mortal, but the soul is immortal. The personality has freedom of choice, whether to become mortal or to leave for eternity. This is the whole point, and everything must grow from here. One must remember that the animal mind is very strong, and a human being, by virtue of his dual nature and because of the swings in his choice between the two natures, is weak. Even those who are steadfastly walking along the spiritual path are exposed to attacks of the animal nature. Should a person get just a little distracted or become slightly tempted by the material, as the animal mind seizes his consciousness at once, often winning during those moments of his life when the personality's choice is particularly important. This is why it is recommended to be vigilant, to work on yourself relentlessly, and not give an inch to your animal nature. If you have stepped on a rake once, know how to avoid it next time. While disseminating spiritual knowledge, there is always a temptation from the animal nature by pride, likening oneself to a superior being, in the desire to appropriate this knowledge and interpret it in one's own way from one's mind, while talking to other people. This is how the distortion of it from the animal nature usually happens, as well as substitution with material concepts, and, as a result, the primordial knowledge is lost. The person must understand that spiritual knowledge is given to all people. The human being is not God, or an angel, or a cherub, and nor is he the Holy Spirit. He is only human, just like all people, since his soul is confined to the multidimensional energy structure, which belongs to the material world. Anastasia, there is another important question, which interests our readers. Can the person give somebody an absolution of his or her sins, forgive anything to anyone in the spiritual sense on behalf of superior spiritual beings? Rigdon, man cannot absolve anyone of sins or pray for anyone, for he himself is imperfect. And no one on earth is given the power to forgive on behalf of superior spiritual beings, and even more so on behalf of God. Absolution of sin is associated with confession, which we have already mentioned in our conversation. It is necessary to understand the psychological nature of the origin of such a phenomenon in religion as confession. The effect of catharsis, from the Greek word katharsis meaning purification, is well known not only to ministers of various religions but also to psychoanalysts and psychotherapists. People knew about it also in ancient times. This is a therapeutic method when a person recalls moving moments of their life, which gave rise to a deep experience of an inner conflict or a psychoneurotic disorder. In fact, for a person, this is a psychological relief, which is inherent in any heart-to-heart conversation, for example, with a friend about one's troubles or problems, after which his state of depression disappears, and the person experiences a kind of a psychological relief. As they say, joy shared is joy doubled, while sorrow shared is sorrow halved. And in most cases, the more pride there is in a person, the harder it is for him or her to confess any wrongdoing. Religion's ministers added this practice to their armory. Confessing an offense was presented as a kind of a sacrifice, which was certain to be followed by a reward, forgiveness of wrongful actions or the remission of sins. This way, they basically dishabituated people from working on themselves spiritually and accustomed them to the thought that, if a person asked sincerely enough, they were sure to receive this forgiveness. I repeat, this is simply a purely psychological technique, which is based on the person's faith. But here is what I want to say in this respect. A heart-to-heart conversation is certainly good. But it only temporarily helps a person experience one of the consequences of his inner conflict at that particular moment, but it does not solve the main thing, removing the cause of the conflict. The roots of the latter lie in the daily habit of thinking, which is mostly related to the concentration of the personality's attention on thoughts and desires of the animal nature. Only the person himself can radically eliminate the cause of such conflict's origin in himself. No one else can do this for him. Only he himself, with his choice and internal changes, by multiplying his good deeds and seriously working on himself, can spiritually purify himself, evolve, and as a mature being, escape from the material captivity, free his soul. Only he himself, thanks to his spiritual work, can on his own leave for the seventh dimension, the seventh heaven, paradise, nirvana, that is, make his spiritual way into the world of God. Any person who truly walks along the spiritual path, who works on himself, and whose life is dominated by his personal, innermost communion with God, love, and connection with the spiritual nature, sooner or later reaches this understanding on his own. People should learn to understand their dual nature, understand and forgive each other's mistakes in such a way as if they themselves were learning this lesson and as if this were happening exactly to them. To err is human. However, spiritually strong people not only acknowledge their mistakes, but they can also learn from them. They have the courage and patience to realize the mistakes made and fix them if possible. One should not be unhappy about what cannot be repaired. But you should double your efforts in what will unfailingly bring spiritual joy not only to you but to other people as well. Life is a real school, where mistakes are lessons, and the gained experience, a mentor. As they say, a smooth sea does not make a skilled sailor. Once he gains wisdom, thanks to the spiritual experience, the person begins to steer his ship confidently and purposefully in the midst of a raging ocean of life, avoiding mistakes of the past, not allowing the elements of the past to toss him from side to side, causing inner conflicts. As sages of the ancient times said, holding life's steering wheel in the raging ocean of life requires, first of all, spiritual work on oneself. For such a brave person who steers his ship through the storm of life's elements, sooner or later a day will come when a completely different, spiritual, pure world, which he has not previously known within himself, will open to his inner eye. This world begets peace in the soul and allows wisdom to emerge victorious out of the elements of matter and moor on the shore of eternity. Anastasia, indeed, one mustn't give cause, first of all, to oneself, for the emergence and strengthening in consciousness of thoughts about different material temptations, and that's a fact. I think that many people would like to live and create in a society where those who walk side by side through life do not trample one another into the mud of egoistic ambitions, negative emotions, and other manifestations of the animal nature, but instead stimulate good in society and treat each other with understanding and respect. Judging by the history of mankind, people have dreamt about it for a long time. Rigden, quite true. So, when the spiritual matters of society are taken care of by society itself and this becomes natural and a priority in it, then there will be order. And for this, it is necessary to create such conditions that the majority of people in this civilization live for spiritual purposes and not for material priorities, like today. This is when all the priestly structures will disappear by themselves, because the structure of secret power over people, which remains at the expense of concealment of the true spiritual knowledge, will cease to exist. People will know about the truth, and it will be available to everyone. Anastasia, yes, qualitative changes in society require a change of mindset of the people themselves who make up this society. All this assumes an innovative way of thinking as well as an innovative culture and behavior, which are, moreover, introduced at the initiative of society itself. Although, in fact, everything new is a well-forgotten old. People have long dreamt of creating an ideal equitable society where freedom and equality would reign. But priests and politicians use this desire of the people's, including it into their promises but in reality, doing everything to prevent this from happening. So this equality actually has always been a formality, even after priests and politicians provoked favorable to them social upheavals, reforms, and revolutions, as well as changes of one religion, party, or social order for another. It is easy to notice that the outcome of such disturbances is always the same: Priests and politicians once again create a management hierarchy, the elite with privileges, that is, the situation in society does not actually change. In fact, only the advertising sign, the name of a social system, or a dominant religion changes. Perhaps, this happens because people have long forgotten what true equality and freedom are. Rigden, people look at treetops, but they do not see the roots. And the bottom line is this: all people are equal and, first of all, when it comes to the conditions of imprisonment in this material world, in the characteristics of their spiritual and animal natures, the transience of their lives, and the temporariness of their stay in this world. All people are born and die alone, and all have their own spiritual destiny, which they themselves form with their own choice. All people are kind by their spiritual nature because everyone has a soul, and in this sense, everyone is kindred and very affine to each other, for souls are united, they are from the world of God. And this unites all people, regardless of the social status, place of residence, religious beliefs, and nationality of their bodies. After all, it is not the people's, new personalities, fault that they got a particular body with certain genetic inheritance of one or another race, or the fact that they were born Chinese, Englishmen, Nigerians, and so on. That is, that their biological, material shell has been reproduced in this or that ethnic group. But note that, despite certain physiological differences, people, regardless of belonging to one or another race, assess themselves and other people, both familiar and unfamiliar to them, by the degree of humaneness. All the peoples have concepts of good and evil. This assessment exists on the battlefield of their consciousness, based on the choice between the spiritual and the animal natures. And the main thing for people is not what their friend's body looks like, but what the person is like on the inside, what his spiritual beauty is. A body is a body. What the majority of people have really learned about their bodies can be summed up by the phrase, "something hurts here." The beauty ideals of the body in the human society are relative, and they are conditioned by advertising of some people and imitation of others. Moreover, different peoples have their own ideas about the beauty of the body. Some people consider it beautiful to lengthen their necks with rings from childhood, while others prefer to have teenage shape. But this is not the point. It is not the fault of people's souls that they have been crammed into these or those bodies. The personality's body, just like all the external conditions of its existence, is a consequence of the chosen priorities, dominant desires, and the choice that was once made by the subpersonalities of the present person. Who divides people so intensely today, splitting the single whole, mankind, into parts, races, ethnic, and various social and religious groups? Politicians and priests. They determine the direction of development of science in various areas, create conditions for people to be involved in expanding and deepening of certain topics, and, consequently, integrating them into the educational system of the younger generation. For example, who studies nations and nationalism? Political scientists. They obtain academic degrees and various rewards for this research and for the development of their different speculative concepts in a general direction assigned to them, according to political orders. So they dig in all directions, inventing different theories, for all of them want to live well and have a decent salary, honor, and respect. For their personal power, global politicians divide nations, and they do this with people's own hands. For example, representatives of science, consciously or without understanding the global essence, carry out for payment the programs and directives of politicians, thus implementing their political decisions and actually promoting in society the perspectives that are beneficial to those in power. Moreover, they base all these theories on numerous historical facts, under the plausible pretext of historical knowledge, demonstrating destructive models of the past supposedly under the slogans of public censure, as in "you mustn't do that." But in fact, this is a demonstration and imposing on people models of stereotypical behavior, and options of how else it can be done, which contribute to even greater division, that is, society's differentiation. For instance, they describe the ideas of class struggle, inequality, racial discrimination, social injustice, division of people into superior and inferior, into the elite and the flock, ways to start wars, and so on. Take any political science textbook of any country of the world. This is a sheer aggravation of xenophobia, from the Greek xenos meaning alien and phobos meaning fear, that is, of rejection, fear, and hatred towards each other, intolerance of anything foreign or unfamiliar, and thus subconsciously adversarial to a person. But no textbook will say how things really are at the highest levels of power, what today's politicians and priests actually build their power upon, and how they exploit entire nations in their profit-making interests. So, division and fragmentation of society are stimulated by world politicians and priests artificially. What for? To create in people's consciousness an image of the enemy and keep the whole society in fear and obedience with this image. So that under this pretext aimed at fighting someone, society would, without thinking, approve the allocation of large funds from the state budget of their country to tighten security measures and for other similar expenses. In other words, the state would thus strengthen its control and power over people. And who represents the state? Groups of politicians, that is, individuals with their own interests. They use this artificially created public fear, which at times is sponsored by them, in order to strengthen their power and simply to plunder the budget under the pretext of secrecy and ensuring the security of the population. Suffice it to look at what is shown to people on television. There is continuous intimidation, about how everything in their country is bad, murders, explosions, robberies, scandals, victims of natural disasters, in other words, constant emergencies and incidents. How can a normal psyche endure all this? And why is this all shown? Isn't there any good news in the world? There is, only it is not shown much on purpose. For they foist that which is deeply repugnant to the spiritual nature of man but which strongly activates his animal nature instead. Politicians and priests actually benefit from a person being like a hunted animal, so that he is dominated by animal fear for his life, and for the masses, by animal servility and aggression towards an artificially created image of an enemy. Then power over such zombified people becomes unlimited. So, society has an inevitable result, while the majority of people wish for equality, freedom, and justice. In the global society, politicians and priests actually stimulate constant wars and incitement of racial, national, and religious hatred among people. Anastasia, yes, sheer deception. This is equivalent to giving shovels to people so that they dig graves for themselves with their own hands, thinking that they are digging a foundation for a new house for their multinational family. Wherever you look, there is factitious, artificial division and fragmentation of humanity. But all this deception can exist only until people change the situation themselves. Rigdon, quite right, everything is in people's hands, or rather, in the way of their thinking. There is one truth. But if the person allows a small difference in it with his mind, the truth eventually becomes infinitely divided emptiness in him. To know the truth does not mean to divide everything in it with the mind, pro or con. To know the truth means to comprehend with the soul its single essence and the infinity of spiritual freedom. From the spiritual nature stems the natural human need to live in equality, brotherhood, unity with the entire humanity, and the realization that all the people on the planet are kindred and very affine to each other in their spiritual component. When the animal nature dominates in a person, it distorts this need. And then the person begins to compare himself with others in the consumer format of thinking, believing himself to be equal to those who, in his opinion, are higher than him in some way and not even remembering about those who are in some way lower than him. And politicians and priests use this with great success by including similar ideas about equality and brotherhood in their slogans, religious writings, political concepts, and laws on pieces of paper. Anastasia, well yes, and then people wonder how it happens when all seem to be brothers and sisters, and constitutions and international conventions talk about the international humanitarian law, about the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, about equality of all people and so on, that is, they are written with care for people and their rights based on the principle of parity. But, in fact, we live in the world of opportunities that are far from equal for all. Written, people are divided by matter and its needs, that is, by the animal nature. But if people are guided by their spiritual nature, then collectively they will be able to overcome any differences among themselves. Perhaps, I will share an ancient Eastern parable about two brothers, which tells a story about the human choice and its consequences. Once long ago, in one settlement, two twin brothers came into the world. Although they were born within minutes of each other, for the rest of his life the firstborn considered himself the elder and therefore, smarter. When the brothers grew up, it so happened that one traveler stopped for a night in their house. He turned out to be a spiritual and a wise person. At that time, the people of the settlement were at war with neighboring people. This war brought a lot of grief to the people. But nobody knew how to avoid the war and death. And the brothers asked the wise man for advice. The spiritual man, after listening to them, told them simple truths about the essence of life and death. He told them what happens in the world of people, about the nature of humans' duality, what keeps him in the chains of ignorance, and how to break free from them. He spoke about how to find the true way, save one's soul, and come to that which lies beyond life and death. In the end, he said, it is only possible to become free from death when one knows the truth. The truth is a domain of the inner. The path to the truth is a domain of the outer. And only having walked this path, will you know the truth and become free from death. But each of the brothers understood the words of the wise man in his own way. And each chose his own path to save his soul. The elder brother decided to perfect himself in spiritual knowledge. He left his native land to avoid participating in the war. Visited many countries, where he studied religions of the local peoples and chose from them what he considered to be the best, that which would lead him to attaining the property of the inner. Eventually, he gained most diverse knowledge and experience and so succeeded in his endeavors that he considered himself an enlightened man endowed by the goodwill of the chosen one. Moreover, he so believed it himself that many people believed him and began to learn from him. The younger brother went to the people and began to tell them the simple truths he had heard from the wise man. Some people listened to his words. Others laughed, thinking that everything in this world is decided by rulers, who listen to the God's advice. But soon even those who laughed at him began to listen to the young man's speeches because his words were honest, there was the truth in them. And people told him that they did not want the war, they did not want to kill anyone and did not want to die themselves. But what were they do, for they were forced to fight by their rulers. To which the young man replied, if rulers can destroy but cannot create, what is their merit? If they cannot resurrect the dead, how can they condemn the living to death? Any person can cut off a branch from a tree, but only a master can attach it to the tree. And the ruler is only human. He is also afraid of death, just like any of you, so he is hiding behind the lives of his warriors, issuing decrees. But his decrees are executed by you. The ruler is one, while you are many. He deceives you, saying that he is strong, for his power is you, doing his will against yours. If people lay down their arms, there will be no one to fight. The power of a mountain is not in the stone lying on its top but in its monolithic nature. And the people were inspired by that wisdom and shared it with the neighboring people, with whom they were at war. The truth was heard. And everyone laid down their weapons. So, in that place, thanks to the ordinary young man who had shared the true word of the wise man with the people, the war stopped and peace came. And many lives were saved by the truth, and many found a path to it. But time passes quickly. Gone were the earthly years of brothers. As they were born on the same day, so they died. Thanks to tireless zeal, the elder brother reached such heights in his spiritual perfection that he could appear before the guardian himself, behind whom towered the Chinvat bridge. And he was allowed to behold with his own eyes his younger brother cross this bridge, and the gatekeeper thrust open before him the gate of eternity. And the highly spiritual elder brother was so amazed by what he had seen that all his subsequent 9 reincarnations he firmly followed the spiritual path of the younger brother, keeping the memory of what he saw and telling people about it. Anastasia: yes, this is a very good parable, educational. It's true, for many people the spiritual remains at the level of high self-opinion instead of real work on yourself, mind you, just like in society as a whole, everything is there on paper, but in reality, it's a road of sorrows. Rigden: actually, it is people who choose how to live, from every individual to a group, from a small to a large community. The world politicians and priests convince people that it is them, as administrative personnel, who are the unifying force, and that without them nations will do nothing. They instill this and divide people constantly, otherwise, peoples would start to act without them, moreover, together. For everything depends on people, they are the ones who implement the plans of priests and politicians, doing real work and carrying out different programs in society. There can be no politician or priest unless people themselves support him. As soon as a politician or priest is deprived of such support, he loses authority and power, everyone forgets about him, and he becomes an ordinary member of society, just like everyone else. Anastasia, please, tell us, what should the model of society be? Today, there are many forms of state and political structure, governance of society, political regimes, and ideologies. However, when you begin to examine closely each individual ideology or such a form, you understand that everything is built on the animal nature, inhumanly. Even if in theory everything is beautifully drawn up, in practice, judging by historical events, it turned out like in the saying, the proof is in the pudding. Rigden: that is because everything that you have listed here is built on politics, that is, on management, power, and the undivided rule of politicians and priests over society. Haven't you noticed that even the words are written separately, state and society? Plus, the state is viewed as a political superstructure of the society and rule of authority over people. Take a look at the etymology of the word state. Translator's note: in the Russian language, for example, Gosударство, state, is a possession of Gosudar, a sovereign. The Old Russian word Gosudar denoted both a particular person with power and a contract formula, for example, Господин Великий Novgorod. This word is connected to Gospodar, that is what an owner, master, or the ruling prince, was called. The Persians in the ancient East had an even more precise definition: the owner of sheep, Gospandar. And do you know how the word politics originated? Anastasia: well, as far as I know, from the Greek words politik, techni, meaning the art of ruling the state. And then some refer to the fact that these words, in their turn, are derived from the Greek words poly, meaning many, and techni, art, craft. Others believe that it originates from the Greek word polis, which ancient Greeks used for their city-states. Rigden: this answer is quite predictable. This information is introduced to the human consciousness through many textbooks and books. But let us delve deeper into details. Where from did ancient Greece receive such a form of social governance, moreover with the self-designation of the highest official in ancient Greek city-states, archon? From ancient Rome, from the then forming supporting nest of the priests of Freemasons, who were actually the ones who established religious cults and forms of social governance for their own purposes, created craft guilds, and so on. Where did the Greeks get such a form of government as a democracy? From the Greek words demos, meaning people, and kratos as power or rule, that is, the rule of the people. From the same place where the Romans got republic, from the Latin words res, meaning matter, and publicus, public, res publica, public matter. All these forms of government were devised by the priests of Freemasons, archons, and promoted them among peoples through public figures. You may wonder why under these so-called public forms of government and political regimes, which republic and democracy represent in the world today, peoples themselves are, in fact, removed from governing their own country. Although on paper everything is written beautifully, the law takes into account methods of collective decision-making, including equal opportunities, granting personal and political rights and freedoms to citizens, and so on. But in reality, we have a real seizure of the people's power by local and central priestly and political elites of the governing bodies and their arbitrary rule. These self-appointed elites almost openly divide public property among themselves, exploit people by neglecting their interests, and use the state resources for their own or their clan's selfish purposes simply for the sake of profit. While public is fed, as always, by promises from election to election. In reality, there is an ordinary behind-the-scenes struggle of financial and political groups, semi-feudal prince-elings and grey cardinals, fighting for an extension of spheres of influence, that is, their feeder. This is happening all over the world and, above all, in civilized countries. The same applies to the ideological models of political power, for example, liberalism, from the Latin word liberalis meaning free, with its implementation of individual freedoms, as well as socialism, from the Latin word socialis meaning social, which is based on the public ideas of social justice, freedom, equality, and so on. I am not even mentioning aggressively oriented ideologies, political regimes, and forms of power based on one-man rule, tyranny, monarchy, or minority rule, oligarchy, aristocracy. So why does such a phenomenon occur in the modern world? Because everything was initially developed based on two stimulants of managing the masses, faith and fear, under the laws of materialism, or rather, the animal mind, in favor of the lower instincts of man, his earthly selfhood, where the spiritual goals, proclaimed on paper, served, and still serve today, only as cover for the actual absolute power of politicians and priests. That is why even today everybody is only talking about an ideal, humanitarian, human society. But is anyone actually creating it in the real world? And even the very formulation of a question about the creation of an ideal society is invariably connected not to society as such but to what will be the form of state power over that society while preserving the same global system of governance over people by, again, priests and politicians.